What is going on, everyone? So before we get started with this week's video, we do have a giveaway winner to announce. So in last week's video, I announced that Scott Walton so generously provided this item right here, a Minerva stopwatch, the exact same model that I use in the field, but he provided this as a giveaway item. And there were 171 of you guys who entered to win the giveaway. I had Siri choose a random number, which is how I selected the winner. Just want to let you guys know that I read through every single entry. I definitely do appreciate the messages that many of you included with the entries as well. I may very well massacre the name of the winner, so I apologize in advance for that, but I will try my best here. The winner is Vishwas Nagaraju. So hopefully that's somewhat in the ballpark to the point where you at least recognize your name there. But yeah, congratulations, and I'll reach out to you in a day or so, but give you the opportunity to see it here in this video. But this week's video is a composition review of my photos from my winter trip. It's been several months since I've returned, and I'm gonna share the photos, share my thoughts, talk about the compositions, show some of the post-processing I did on those photos, and even show a photo that didn't make it into the videos that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. But hope you guys enjoy. So let's start by taking a look at the first photo I shot on the winter trip. So this is what it looks like here in Photoshop, and I have a bunch of adjustment layers with curves and saturation and things to sort of bring it back to reality. Because if you remember, this is a photo that I overexposed, and when you work with slide film, you really got to avoid overexposure. Underexposure is also the enemy. You need to have that perfect exposure, but the light was changing so fast on this scene, it was tough to work with. But if I turn off all of my adjustment layers here, this is what the original file looks like. And I scanned this in a way to try to preserve as much information as I can in the highlights, but ultimately I was limited by whatever it was that the film had. So I'm going to turn these layers on a little bit at a time. And I edited this in two parts. Basically, the foreground I edited differently than the sky. Because it really needed that sort of massaging of the information to get out of the file. So I start with a curves layer and a levels layer to restore a bit of contrast to the foreground. The color goes a little bit funky. That's what happens if you have a picture that's too bright, you darken it down, and I'll tame the color on it in a little bit later on. Then I have another layer here, which is going to be just for the sky. And then I have a curves adjustment on that to sort of bring it down a little bit, get a little detail out of there. Then I have another layer I'm working with, which is going to be really just for the sky as well as a reflection there. Again, I'm sort of trying to massage some detail out of it. And then I have another layer where I have a darkening across the top as well as over here, just to give it a bit more of a natural appearance and kind of keep the eye towards the mountains there. One of the things I noticed is that this area here got a little bit on the bright side. And so I have another curves layer with the layer mask just to darken that area down, just to make it blend in a little bit more. I think that was a result of the grad filter covering down to about here, and then that area got a little bit on the bright side. Hue saturation, I'm just kicking up the warm tones there to bring it back to a bit more like reality. But I also noticed that the foreground, as I mentioned earlier, it got a little bit too blue when I increased the contrast and darkened the exposure on a little bit. So this layer right here takes down the blues in the foreground to bring a more natural appearance to it. Finally, I have a levels layer up top. I like to mark those in red because those are especially useful if I print a photo, because those make sure I have the proper level so that it's going to map out really nice on the paper. So that's the editing that I did. And again, this is the before, and then all the Photoshop work brought it to life, and so we have a pretty natural looking file now. So let's talk about the composition on this scene. So the trickiest thing on this particular scene was this Salt Creek. It's a photo that looks pretty simple. Looks like, oh, you just kind of stand there, Salt Creek kind of meanders through the image. But the tricky thing was that the Salt Creek got really narrow really, really fast. Basically immediately outside the bottom edge of this photo, it tapered down to like a really small, narrow little area. It looked really weird when that was entering into the composition. So I knew I needed to find an angle which gave the appearance of this being relatively consistent, even though it started out in real life being maybe about that narrow, and then fanning out to be pretty big, pretty fast. I wanted to avoid having that creek enter from the corner. In the past, I would align things with the corner, but there's something about it which is almost a little bit unsettling. So I knew that having it enter from the bottom edge would give a more pleasing composition. I was glad I was able to find a solution for that. I was paying really close attention to the distance over here between this sort of fluffy salt area and the right edge, and then over here between this boundary here and the left edge. In a perfect world, I wouldn't mind a hair more image there on the left side, but I wasn't able to do that while maintaining the bottom there with the creek entering from a natural area. I was also paying pretty close attention to the placement of these little salt islands back here in relation to the reflection of the mountain. And I thought it would be a bigger deal than it was. I was trying to avoid the conflict between that and the edge, but I think that really doesn't make much of a difference. And I find that there are certain things that I pay close attention in the field that once you see the photo, it doesn't really matter, and that falls into that category. If we take a look at the light on the scene here, one of the things that was really cool is this band of warm light that stretches all the way across the frame. And I really like the way that that tied together. And my timing on this one, this was like about the last possible second I could have exposed this film, because pretty soon the reflection, you're not gonna have that warm light in the reflection right there. And then this shadow is just starting to creep up there. So I'm glad that that worked out. Now this was taken with a 240 millimeter lens, which is equivalent to maybe like a 28 millimeter, somewhere in about that range on a full frame camera. So it's a moderate wide, but it's not a very, very wide angle. And a 240 millimeter lens is more forgiving than using a normal lens in terms of depth of field. But 8x10, we have a very shallow depth of field to work with, and we have to do all kinds of tricks to make sure that we get as much of the scene in focus. And there's oftentimes sacrifices that we need to make in order to make that happen. So a scene like this, I can use what they call front tilt, which is where you take the front of the camera, which has the lens on it, and you tilt it down just a little bit, just like that. And when you do that, the plane of focus is going to drop down at an angle. And this allows us to get more of the scene in focus. A scene like this, for me, this foreground was really important. This midground is very important. The tops of the mountains, not quite as important, because I can really get two of them. I can't get everything in focus. So as I use a bit of front tilt and the plane of focus drops down at an angle, I basically made it where the foreground, maybe about right in here, this area was in sharp focus, and then these mountains back here were in sharp focus, which means the plane of focus is skimming over the midground like this. When you stop down the lens, it expands into a wedge. Most of it drops down, a little bit of it rises up. And you want the bottom of that wedge to skim the whole land area there. And then the top is gonna come up to about here. It never really gets that much higher than the mountains. So if I were to zoom in and go to this bottom edge over here, I'm not completely 100% sharp at the base, but I'm really, really good. By the time you get up to about here, I mean, it's tack sharp. Then you go all the way up here, you see this ground plane is really, really sharp. Those bushes there, super sharp. You go all the way up, very sharp. But once you get up to about here, you'll notice that the very top of the mountain is blurry. And that was a strategic decision I made because I knew I was not gonna be able to get the extreme foreground, the midground, all the way to there. But if I do go to these back mountains over here, you'll see that those mountains are tack sharp all the way to their top. So that was a little decision I was making, and that's why I like to get there early and spend the time debating the composition so I can figure out exactly where that should be, figure out the placement of everything, and make the decisions with regard to the plane of focus, because that sort of stuff is really hard to do as the light's changing fast. Considering I made all those decisions ahead of time, I still had a difficult time with this because the light was changing so fast. But I'm very happy with that photo. I have zero regrets about the composition, and I'm glad the exposure worked on that one. So very happy with that. Let's look at this photo. This was my surprise photo I shot alongside the road. There's a very interesting looking hoodoo there, which caught some really interesting light. The hoodoo had a little bit of a warmer tone to it than the area around it. And I think that was further accentuated by the light, because this was catching a little bit more light coming up from an area that was sunlit and reflecting some light onto it. So it was a really cool scene. One thing that stood out to me immediately was this sort of X shape. And I had very little time to compose this photo because direct sunlight was going to creep into view, and then the very nice subdued light would be gone. And initially I was going to center the hoodoo, but upon looking at the ground glass, I favored having it slightly off to the right, because if you look at the top of the hoodoo, it kind of points upward a little bit, and then that catches this line right here. So I liked that sort of motion, and with a directionality like that, I knew I needed to have it offset a little bit to the right side of the photo. So when I was composing it, I was paying close attention to this distance. I was paying close attention to this area right here, which does admittedly a little bit go towards the corner, but kind of falls short of it. So I was looking at all this stuff here, making sure I had enough breathing room. And it wasn't really until after I saw the film that I noticed there's like some motion right here that kind of comes up and around. So you get this really cool like flux capacitor kind of figure 8 style motion going on there, which is kind of cool. The top part of the photo here, this dark area, kind of serves to keep the eye within the frame. So it has a really nice motion to it. But when I saw it for the first time, I loved it. But the more I looked at it, there was something about this photo that bugged me. And at first I thought it was the fact that this right here doesn't align super well with that right there. I thought that maybe if I had taken a slight step to the right, I could have had a little bit of a better composition there. But then I realized that that's not what was bothering me. It was this dark area right here. So this is right up against the hoodoo. It just steals attention away from the hoodoo, and it's a bit of a distracting element. There's no other dark areas like that within the frame. And so I did some adjustments on it to minimize it. So I'm going to show you what I did there. So first of all, this is the end result. So I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little better detail. So that is the after, there's the before. And I tried to work mostly with what was there because it's a tricky area, you can't just clone over it. So I'll show you here bit by bit what I did. So I started with a selection of just that area, and I did a curves adjustment just to sort of brighten it up. I did a color balance adjustment to give it a little bit more of a blue tone. I did hue saturation, and again tried to blend it in a little bit more there. And after doing that, I kind of created that as its own layer, and then I did a little bit of touch up because there is a natural edge along there that really was there. So if I turn that layer off, you see there is actually a rough kind of edge along there. But I cleaned it up a little bit with a little bit of cloning there. So by getting rid of that element, it now allows a bit more attention to be placed on the actual hoodoo. So there it is before, there it is after, right there. So I want to make it so it blends in a little bit more with these areas over here, which I think it does. So that was the only thing I really had to do on that. If you look at the edits I did on the photo itself, I'll turn those off. So this is my original scan. I had to scan it a little bit dark because these areas in here were really sensitive to being overexposed. So I did a curves adjustment to try to restore a little bit of contrast to it. Hue saturation to kind of warm up these areas just a little bit there. It's very subtle, but there it is with the hue saturation. I did a photo filter to add a little bit of warmth. So it's a warming filter to counteract a little bit of the cool tone. And then a little bit of a levels adjustment just to add that little bit of kick of contrast to make it where it's going to be print worthy. So that was a surprise for the trip. I was actually quite happy with how that one turned out. And I really liked the movement in that scene. It was just dealing with that one stubborn dark area that was off to the side. Next up, so this is that scene I found that has the leaf embedded in the ice. And this is a drum scan. So this one was scanned at over 300 megapixels. And actually, if you look at the image here, you'll see that it is 64 inches on the long side. So it's a big file. If I were to zoom in all the way to the leaf here, and I'm at 200% now, which is more like 100% on the 4K monitor here, or 5K monitor or whatever, but you'll see that there are some bubbles of air there embedded within the ice because the stem actually drops down into the ice. So it's really fascinating to see all the detail and everything that drum scan picks up. The other thing too about having a drum scan is you notice some details. Actually, I think I cloned it out. There's a dead bug up top, but I think I cloned that one out. Yeah, it was right here. So all kinds of things that you don't realize how many dead bugs are in your photos until you get a really high resolution drum scan of the photo. But I did get rid of that bug. So let's talk about the composition on this one. So with this scene, I had a distracting element right here at the bottom. So it was the edge of the ice, there was a rock there, and I was trying to avoid having that area creep into view. But ultimately, I was also paying really close attention to this space right here and this space right here. And if I completely eliminated that, I'd be getting a little close to the bottom. So stuff like that I find to be acceptable when it comes to letting some things kind of creep into the photo a little bit, just so long as you have a purpose for them. I paid very close attention to this section here and the space right there. And I wanted to have it where, again, I didn't want this pointing right towards a corner necessarily, but a little off the edge of the corner. I liked all the lines there. At first, I wish that the leaf wasn't tilting away. I wish it was tilted more straight or that way. Not that I had any control over it because it's frozen in the ice. But now actually, I'm kind of digging the way that the leaf is at an angle because I think it creates a wonderful sense of motion. And I was really, really happy with the way that this one turned out. And again, all it really was dealing with this distraction down here, paying close attention to this and make sure it didn't get too close to the edge where it'd be a distraction. And again, just making sure I had some nice spacing in there. The editing for this one was pretty straightforward. If I turn off all my adjustments, you see this is Velvia 50. It had a little bit of a magenta tone. So I did a curves adjustment. And then I did a hue saturation to reduce the saturation. So the curves adjustment added a little more contrast, got rid of a little bit of the magenta. Hue saturation to reduce the saturation a little bit more. Again, I want it to be a pretty natural appearance for this photo. I don't remember what this one was. Oh, it got a little too blue down here. So by using that layer adjustment, I was able to kind of reduce that a little bit to make it blend in a little bit more. And then finally, a very slight tweak of the levels just to make sure I have some good rich dark tone and some good bright tone for printing it. But that one did not take too much work to edit. Next up is the photo of the ice, the detail photo of the ice. This is fairly simple photo to shoot. I mean, it's tricky from the standpoint that the camera had to be positioned at a really weird angle. But that being said, it's just filling the frame with chaos. I did like that there were some dark areas within there, but there really wasn't too much to it other than me just trying to fill the frame with chaos. If I turn off all my adjustment layers, again, this was a drum scan, very, very high resolution. And my friend Michael Strickland scanned this one for me. And when you have your film drum scan, basically you need to make sure that you have detail in the brightest areas and the darkest areas. And so to make sure that I didn't lose detail in the brightest areas, you see it's kind of a bit of a flat scan. So I did a curves adjustment to brighten it up a little bit, hue saturation to reduce the saturation a little bit, and then levels to put just a little bit more contrast where it needed to be. And one thing I want to show you here, if I open this one up here in Photoshop, this is a photo of the actual scene I was photographing. This didn't make it into the videos themselves, but this gives you a little bit more of a perspective of the scene I was shooting, the scale of it. And I'm just filling the frame with this area right here. It also shows you how the camera was placed at a really odd angle in order to make it all work there. Yeah, definitely pretty happy with the way that one turned out. Then here is the photo of the river reflection. This one, I shot this on both Velvia as well as ProVia. I ended up going with the ProVia one because I had a faster shutter speed. It's a 100-speed film, but also the color was a little easier to work with. Now it's a tricky scene because we got some really strong, bold color here. And ProVia has a mind of its own sometimes, Velvia has a mind of its own sometimes, so I try to get it back to reality. So this is what the original scan looks like. Now this doesn't really reflect the experience of looking at the film because when I scan it to be relatively flat. So I scan this knowing it's going to go very cyan. It's not going to pick up the color as much, but it's a good base image to work with. And so I added a curves layer to put a little bit of contrast back in there. Did a hue saturation to restore a little bit of the saturation there, but we still have this really heavily cyan image. I use color balance to warm things up a little bit and try to get back to some degree of reality for the scene. There was a really bright area here that was bugging me, so I did a curves layer just to work with that area a little bit. And then I added a little bit of a vignette. Did a little bit of a burning just to darken that down a little bit. This scene, I used my longer lens, just like that first scene I photographed. I used a little bit of front tilt, so the front lens, the front stand of the camera, drops down a little bit so that plane of focus follows everything in here. And the tricky thing was the foreground. There was never really a great point to cut off the foreground. I felt like it's a little awkward down here. I feel like I could use a little more or a little less space, but there never really was a great spot to have that foreground start or stop. There was always going to be these rocks that were cut off partway through. But that was one thing I was paying attention to. I was paying close attention to all this, this sort of shore of rocks over here, this area over here, because I want to have a flow of the image that kind of worked its way through there. This rock, this rock, this rock, this rock, these are all dominant rocks, so I wanted to have good space around them. If I do zoom into this one, if any of you guys have been to Zion, chances are that if you look at a photo like this and you see these nice colors reflected in the water here, this probably transports you back to Zion a little bit just looking at those colors. I know it does for me right now, taking a look at this, and definitely makes me want to get my car to drive to Zion right now. But if we look at this scene, you'll see much like the first photo I showed you where the top of the mountains weren't sharp, we're going to have something similar happening here. So you see that the rocks are tack sharp all the way through, very sharp all the way through here. The reeds and grass in the foreground is nice and sharp, pretty good. But then once we get to about here, you see that I am now going to get blurry up top. So that's just because the top of that plane of the wedge of focus, the top of it is going to go right about through here. So it's going to get that river bank, everything, but the bushes, everything above that is going to fall short of that. And again, that's by design, and those are the sort of decisions that we make with large format because I have all the important stuff in focus and not as much the other stuff. So this one also turned out pretty decent. Again, some reservations about the foreground there, but there wasn't really any other solutions I had for that. But that one was kind of cool. Now here's a photo that I showed a little bit in the videos just as film, but I hadn't scanned it for the videos, and it's a little bit of a surprise. So this is the sheet of film I shot in Death Valley of the Dunes. This was taken on Velvia 50 right as the sun had partially set back behind the mountains. So you have this sort of mixture of warm light as well as ambient light. It's a very short-lived moment, and just after shooting this, the sun was gone. Literally probably 10-15 seconds after I was done with this, no more sun. And when I was composing this, I thought I needed these dunes in the background. I thought it was going to have a nice flow to it. But upon seeing the film, it bugged me. There was something about it. It was too complicated. It was too complex. There was too many lines going in different directions. And then I started playing with it a little bit. And so if I go over here to the history, I did a crop like this. And a simple square crop of this image brings about kind of a breath of fresh air. Very, very simple. A square is a very simple it's a simple shape, but it's hard to compose photos for a square. But textures, symmetry, stuff along those lines often looks good as a square. And I really like the way that this looks as a square, but the only challenge is this is the only square photo that would be in my portfolio. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are on this one. It would print beautifully if I zoom way in. Again, this is just a flatbed scan. If I zoom in to 200%, you see every grain of sand there is rendered. Really good exposure. But perhaps this is more of a proof of concept for a photo like this in the future, where if I can find just a regular, use a whole sheet of film for the photo, I think I can come across with something special. I now know the technique for doing the exposure. I now know that that light looks really good, especially with Velvia 50. But this was a little bit of a surprise, but also the fact that it's a square and being the only square in my portfolio does throw me off a little bit. But definitely glad that that one at least worked out. But overall, I'm really happy with the way the photos turned out, especially that first photo, because that really gives a feeling of being there. So I had some nice surprises in the mix, like the roadside hoodoo. I was very lucky to have that scene with the leaf embedded in the ice. That ice pattern, just to me, it looks like candy. I kind of want to eat that photo. And then the reflection there. So yeah, I'd be curious to know your guys' thoughts on how this turned out, especially with the sand photo at the end there. And I do want to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you around next time.